going to talk about lattice patterns today, and the genesis of this is something that Christian Lindow came up with sometime in the past year. I guess he's been working on it, and I came down and got pretty interested in what he was doing, so we've been collaborating a little, but Christian has been certainly the driver behind the developments in this pattern. It's something, dare I say, new. That's always a risky thing to claim because there aren't too many new things around. But we can say at least that we have no evidence at the moment that this kind of thing has been done in ornamental turning before. Done plenty of other places. The lattice pattern itself is hardly unique. All right, here's an example of a lattice pattern done in marble in India. Very pretty, classic stuff. One way of employing that type of pattern. Here's something considerably more primitive and closer to home. A country quilt done with a similar kind of geometric relationship. This one, by the way, has an interesting name. It's called Rob Peter to Pay Paul. It's the name of the pattern. And the reason it has that name is if you look at it, you can see that the colors from one section of the pattern that are cut out are plugged in on the other section of the pattern. Hence, robbing Peter. The type of pattern we're going to talk about today is this sort of thing. This was done on a Rose engine, but does it look like Rose engine work to anybody? No, you don't really, it doesn't jump out at you, certainly. This one was done with an Archie 4 rosette, and we'll talk now a little bit about just how it got done. One of the things you'll struggle with if you play with this stuff at all is the optical illusions that this type of pattern creates. This is the classic here, but you'll find with many of these lattice patterns done on the Rose engine that you'll look at it and your recognition of the pattern will fade in and out. Sometimes you see the rosette that built it, sometimes you see only the pattern, but it's hard to, you can't see them both at the same time. It's an interesting visual challenge. Here's pretty much the basic definition of what we're talking about. It's a technique for overlapping rosette profiles, and the pattern is created at the overlap. You can do it in one of two general configurations. You can do a rectangular array or a hexagonal one. The hexagonal one would look pretty much like a honeycomb. The rectangular array is the foundation for the most basic lattice pattern. What I'd like to point out is, if you notice here, you see there's a central circle. I'm going to call these matrices base circles. You don't see them in the lattice pattern, but they're fundamental to it because the centers of these base circles are the centers of the rosettes that are going to create the profile. And what you'll be doing is you'll have a base circle of diameter x, and you'll have a rosette profile of x plus something. So when you plop a rosette profile on the smaller base circle, and you do the same thing to the one next to it, you create an overlap pattern. This is the same general situation with a central base circle, but arrayed in a hexagonal pattern around it, a 60-degree hexagon. What you need to do this. Christian was, and still is, I believe, using a double eccentric chuck, and he's using a different technique than we're going to see today. I'll explain that in a minute. But basically, for what we're going to discuss, you need to have a rosette with a lobe count that's configured for either a rectangular or hexagonal pattern. It's going to be divisible by 4 if you're going to do a rectangular pattern, or the number of lobes is what I'm talking about, has to be divisible by 6 if you're going to do the hexagonal one. You need a simple eccentric chuck, but it has to have a worm wheel on it. If you have one with a 96 tooth ratchet, you can't get fine enough, fractional angular adjustments. And you'll need a worm wheel also on the rosette barrel to phase the rosette. But most of the Rose engines have that. And of course, the tool slide comes with every machine. Now, Christian has been using a double eccentric chuck, I believe I mentioned, and he's using Cartesian coordinates. That's a traditional X and Y from your high school algebra to locate the points. What we're doing here is we're building this matrix of base circles, locating their centers, and then putting a rosette profile on each one of those centers. So you have to define the center points of these base circles. And polar coordinates is a way you can do it if you don't have a double eccentric chuck. It fits very nicely. The way it works, the polar coordinates are not as familiar to most people as Cartesian, but you have a 0 degree line here, and you have a point out here that you want to define. You want to tell where that point is. The way you do it is you say, from the 0 degree line, it's so many degrees, 54.8 in this illustration, and it's so much distance from the origin, 1.103 inches. Those two datum define a point. And you're going to do that for every base circle center in the matrix. Here's an example. This is a rectangular matrix. It's just the first row of the matrix. You have the central base circle and the first row around it. And you can see how the polar coordinates are working. You set those coordinates up as a table. So in row 1, the first polar coordinate, it says angle is 0 and eccentricity of the chuck slides 1 inch. So you start from the center, 0 angle is up here, you go up 1 inch, there's the center of your base circle. The next line on the table, 15, which is 45 degrees. Remember, we're working with a 120 degree wheel, worm wheel. So 45 degrees or 15 on the worm wheel and out 1.414 and so forth, and just step around like that. And it's the same process for the second and third rows to build a matrix. The table you use has 3 sets of rows 1, 2, and 3. And because the number of base circles increases as you move outwards, each table is a little longer than a previous one. Here's kind of what it looks like with a 3-row matrix. And the thing to point out here is that you're not dealing with a different distance from center for each base circle center in the matrix. For the first row, there are only 2. The second row only has 1, 2, 3. And the third row only has 4. So you'll see those numbers repeating throughout the table, up and down, as you go through the exercise. Now, the yellow here represents the base circle, and the size you select for your base circle is a key determinant of the kind of pattern you get. If you choose a smaller base circle, your pattern will likely be kind of, more detailed, more dense. As you open up that base circle, it opens the pattern up and you get a different visual effect. The blue area around the base circle here represents the overlap. So let's take the concept of the base circle and the overlap here and have a look at what it looks like when you do the first set around the, let's see here. Yeah, okay. Here's your overlaps in blue, just what we showed you before. Whoops, too quick on the trigger. Okay. Now, you have to decide how much overlap as well. You've picked the base circle size, but your amount of overlap is key also. And there's no hard and fast rule as to what size you use. You can have it be very tight or not. There is a kind of a compelling logic that gives you a good place to start, and that is to have the overlap profiles cross right in the center of this void here. And you'll find that's pretty easily calculated and done. So my suggestion would be, if you're going to play with this, start with this approach with this point of intersection being in the center here, and go from there depending on your judgment as to what's going to improve the effect. When you take away the grid and so forth, you start to see the effect of the overlap in yellow. The pattern emerges. Now, these are just smooth circles. And as an opener, just to get the feel of this, I would strongly suggest that you just use a base circle and then a smooth circle as your overlap. And just a couple runs through, and you'll have that down, and then you can start playing with rosette profiles that introduce some other complications that I'm about to share with you, because nothing good is simple. All right. If you're going to use a rosette that has lobes on it and a profile, one of the things you need to be concerned about is you're going to start plopping these rosettes onto your workpiece, and you want to have that rosette oriented properly. For any given rosette, there's probably a position where it looks right. Either the high point in the rosette profile will be at 12 o'clock, or the low point of V or something. There's some characteristic where it looks right. If you just arbitrarily start sticking that profile on there without being concerned about this, you get something sort of like this. It looks like a line of drunk soldiers leaning on one another, But if you take the same notion, but you put the high point vertical, now there's an interesting geometric pattern that emerges. And similarly, if you take the low point, another regular pattern emerges. So you'll need to fuss a bit with the worm wheel on the rosette barrel to bring that profile to where you want it. Here's a second problem. The polar coordinate approach is terrific. It puts the base circle centers, that's what we're talking about here, right where you want them. Unfortunately, it's a radial motion. So when you swing the nose of your chuck around using the worm wheel, you alter the position of the rosette. And that needs to be corrected. And the way you do it is you go ahead and you locate your center point. Let me get the right button here. You have the right center point, and you've used the right angle here, but your rosette was out of whack. If you take the worm wheel on the rosette barrel and rotate that back the same amount that you went forward with the worm wheel on the chuck, Now, what you've done is you spun that rosette profile around on its center. And it's now going to be exactly where you want it, and you can march through the matrix in that method. So here's the summary, if you will, of the steps involved. The ones in red are one time only. You do this at the beginning, and then you don't have to touch it. Get your tool on center. You set the radius you've determined for your rosette profile on the tool slide, and that's done. That's going to stay the same all the way through the matrix for every rotation of the spindle. The second thing, once with the chuck in the level position, you have to pick, to avoid the drunk soldiers in a line, you have to pick the point on the rosette profile and orient it to where you want it to be. Now, what that creates is a need, we're working off tables to do this. And you can't determine the angular setting on the rosette barrel worm until you've positioned your rosette initially. And let's say, in order to do that, when you look down at the worm wheel, it's at, 24 degrees. So 24 degrees becomes your zero. And it means that every step subsequent to that needs to start from 24 degrees, not zero. And you don't want to be doing this in your head. You need to do it and develop your table before you ever touch the rose engine. Okay. And we'll talk about that a little more in a minute. It's not very daunting to do, but it needs to be considered. Okay. Now these 1, 2, and 3 are the steps you're going to repeat for every rosette profile that you put in the lattice pattern. You set the eccentricity on your chuck slide, taking the distance from the table. You set your angle again from the table on the chuck spindle, and then in the opposite direction, you phase the rosette worm back to correct the attitude of your rosette profile. Here's a table. This is for the first row that you'd typically be working on for a rectangular array. And hopefully it looks somewhat familiar. Here's your slide distance that you set for your chuck. Here's the eccentric chuck worm wheel, and we start that at 0 on the scale because we've got to keep something simple. But over here, ideally, in a perfect world, we'd be starting at 0 on both worm wheels, and it'd be easy to keep track. But no, in this particular instance, we started at 23 because we had to straighten out our rosette. So we have to reduce that 23 by 15 each time we go down a row. The trigger happy. Fortunately, these are constants, so that helps somewhat. But it takes probably, to do the adjustments for 3 rows, which is a pretty good sized pattern, I don't think it takes 10 minutes to do. You can really zip through them. And we had just looked at this previously, but again, these are the distance settings from center for your 3 rows of your array. So here's step 1. Don't laugh at my rosette profile. All I had is SketchUp, so little bumps on a big bump was the best I could do. You set your tool on center, and you set your tool slide to a rosette radius of 0.707. That's not an arbitrary number. That's for a 1-inch base circle. 0.707 gives you a rosette overlap that exactly intercepts at that void we were talking about. Right at the center. And then you make your first cut, and this is your center rosette. And this is just the same table we looked at before. And then you'd go second line, you move your slide out to 1.414, advance your worm wheel by 15 graduations, go back 8 graduations on the worm wheel on the rosette barrel. I just realized there's an error here that I need to correct. All of these should properly be minuses to reflect the directional zone. Second step, now that you have your central rosette profile, is from your table, you've gone from the center up 1, that's what the table told you to do. It was 0 degrees. There's your center. Make another rosette profile. Back to the table. Go to the second, we'll just do a couple more. The second center, here's your distance. You had your angle from the table. You've rotated it back the same amount on the rosette rosette barrel worm, and it's complete. And you've established an overlap. Then you continue around, just taking the values from each row on the table. This is what it looks like when you've gone around once. And you're starting to see a pattern emerge, even from this sort of funky rosette I made. If you take out the grid, just to get rid of a little visual clutter, the pattern emerges a little more. And if you trim the pattern, and you can do this on a workpiece by simply sizing your pattern to go past the edges, so you're only picking up the central area of the pattern. Now you have something that, well, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't immediately relate it to the profile of the rosette that built it. You know, it's kind of different. And I did this just for fun. This is to get the visual impact of a larger array of this particular profile. For a hexagonal array, it's really not very different. You remember, you need to have a rosette with the lobe count that's divisible by 6, but that's the primary difference from an operational standpoint. And this particular one has 18 lobes, so it should work. You build your table the same way, with the distance you have to move the slide on the chuck, the degree, the degree setting on the worm wheel, and the degree amount that you're going to reverse the worm wheel barrel. And you'll notice, by the way, the increments are the same. 20 to 40, 40 to 60 is 20 degrees, 20 degrees, 20 degrees. And a quick and easy check is these two numbers, if you add them, always add up to 120 on a 120 degree worm wheel. Okay, we did the first row on this pattern, just stepping through the table, as we discussed. Did the second row, and you can see the hexagonal matrix. You can see the rosette centers now aren't determined quite the same way they were with the rectangular grid. We've got a hexagon going instead. Take the grid off so you get a better look at it, and trim it. And here again, where's the rosette profile you had a couple minutes ago? It's kind of gone. And now this is an example of how you might want to play with the size of your overlap. It could very well be that by increasing it or decreasing it slightly, this could be made more pleasing to the eye. And a little experimentation will tell you quickly whether or not that'll be the case. It's good news. Y'all could use some good news, right? Good news is that those angles for these arrays stay the same for all of them. So the only thing you need to do is that zero adjustment when you first position your rosette profile. After that, you're good. Oh, look at this. The table that we were using was for a 1-inch base circle. Well, it so happens that this relationship in this matrix is directly proportional to the size of the base circle. So if you'd like to do a base circle that's, say, 0.4 inches, you just take the 1-inch table and multiply it by 0.4, and you're there. It's that simple a conversion. There's no trig, no anything like that involved. You see some variations on the theme, things you can do besides just varying the pattern itself. This simple line is where we started. If you do a deeper cut, all of a sudden it's much more dramatic. And that has possibilities. Fine detail could get interesting in certain applications. Gold fills. This is one Christian did where he cut the pattern, did the gold fill, sanded off the excess, and you have a pattern that pops out dramatically. Particularly, he used this in the bottom of a box. I don't know, you may have seen it. But you look down in the box and it's pretty spectacular. Here's a colored background where the pattern was cut through the colored background. So that may have some possibilities also. Step cutters. There's some guy that makes step cutters around here somewhere.
It's his fault.
Yeah. Put your hand up, Chris, so you can be identified. Yeah. But now this can be mind-blowing, particularly if you're the unfortunate individual charged with trying to figure out what rosette did it. And that's it, folks.